Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Physionic podcast. My name is Nicholas Verhoeven. I'm a PhD student in molecular medicine, and I have my master's in exercise physiology and was an ACSM certified personal trainer as well. Now, those credentials, I'm putting those out there because the first topic that I'm going to be discussing in this podcast is maintaining and gaining muscle during the quarantine period or during the phases at which we're at where we don't have access to a gym. So I'm going to be discussing that, some different techniques. I'd actually planned on making that particular topic a while back, maybe like 2 months ago, and I'd written the dialogue out and whatnot, but I ended up going with a bunch of other content instead. But I wanted to cover it anyways. I believe that in one of the other podcasts I did cover a workout that people could do, but I didn't go into any serious detail with how to manipulate the different variables when it comes to exercise to lead to, at the very least, a maintenance of muscle mass, but hopefully an increase in muscle mass as well. The second topic is to discuss a bit on cancer, so more specifically, why chemotherapy stops working after some time. The reason why I'm covering this is because my mom's dog actually has cancer and stage 5 lymphoma, and was going through chemotherapy with the idea, of course, that we knew that, or I had to explain it, that it wasn't going to end up lasting. It's not something that's going to cure cancer in this particular situation with lymphoma. But I do find it interesting, and I think that people don't fully understand why chemotherapy, or first of all, how chemotherapy functions kind of in a general sense, but also why cancer then comes back, why chemotherapy stops working after a certain amount of time. And this is really specific to particular cancers in this situation, but it certainly could be the case for essentially any cancer. So I'll be touching on that as well. So those are the two topics. And of course, as always, I'll have the timestamps so that you can skip to whichever topic you would like to listen to. And there's also audio versions of this podcast. If you're not already listening to this on an audio version, or you're watching the actual video version, then you can check out those links that I'll have for you as well. Okay, so let's jump into the applicable aspect. Let's talk about maintaining and gaining musculature during social isolation, or I guess I should say during this quarantine period, where gyms aren't necessarily open, and if they do open, they're at limited capacity. If they're at limited capacity, they may end up closing again in the future once, most likely, we're going to have a second wave of this coronavirus hit. Although we're already pretty deep into the cases continuing to rise, at least in the United States. Okay, so there are two variables that people need to consider when talking about weightlifting or building musculature. And this, just to clarify, when I say building musculature, I am also talking to people who are trying to tone. So the term tone is essentially synonymous with building muscle. People don't realize that, but they are the same. So if you're trying to create tone or just get jacked, then you can do that. Even if you don't have a ton of equipment, you don't even necessarily have to have any equipment, although having some equipment is certainly beneficial. But there are certain things that people can do to manipulate two specific variables. And I've talked on these variables before, one of them being volume, so the amount of work that you do over a given amount of time. So if you clamp the amount of time that you're going to be measuring the amount of work that you do over that time, then you can continuously ramp up the amount of work that you do in a given amount of time. A good example of this would be within, let's say, we clamp the time at 1 week. So within 1 week, you want to achieve X amount of weight lifted, X amount of resistance lifted, X amount of, then the second variable is intensity lifted. So volume has to continue to rise over time to see an increase in musculature. Now, of course, there are details here that I'm not going into, like different periodization methods and things of that nature. I'm not going to dive into that for this episode, but I did want to touch on kind of the general things that you can do relating to this kind of increase in volume. So clearly you want to be slowly increasing your volume. Now, the big issue here is, let's say you've been going to the gym. This is not an issue for people that are complete beginners and are just starting a weightlifting program or just starting an exercise program in general. This is really for people that are, let's say they've been going to the gym for 3 months, 6 months, 6 years, for a long period of time. And they want to maintain their musculature and, like I said, potentially even continue gaining musculature over the time that they don't have access to all the equipment that they had. So if at one point you were squatting, let's say, 275 for 5 repetitions or something along those lines, and you had this base volume and this base intensity that you were saying the word again, but basing things off of, then you had an idea of where your strength was, how much fatigue you would accumulate by doing X amount of work, doing X amount of volume in a session, and then you could just base it off that and just continue to increase over time. Again, with some nuances there that I won't be going into. But that certainly changes quite a bit when you don't have much equipment, or you're extremely limited on the equipment that you have, or maybe you don't have any equipment. So how do you translate that set of 275 pounds on the squat to something that you can actually use when you're at home and you're in your apartment or in your house or in your garage or wherever it might be, and you don't have 275 pounds to put onto your back and therefore create that same level of difficulty, the same level of intensity. So intensity being the amount of resistance lifted within a particular set, or actually you could even say within a particular repetition. So 275 pounds in this example is the intensity of the lift. Now, what also plays into that, of course, is the number of repetitions that you do and the number of sets you do. But that, I would characterize that as more towards volume, so the overall work that you do. So if you're doing 3 sets of 5 repetitions at 275 pounds, you multiply those out, and that gives you your volume. Now, if you were to do 5 sets of 5 at 275 pounds, you multiply those out. Of course, that's going to be higher, right? So you're doing more volume, and therefore you would see increases in muscle growth. Again, I'm keeping this really basic here, so there's certainly nuances. I don't want you to think that it's just straight mathematics, basic mathematics. So now you're translating this, and you want to maintain that booty that you've been building up for the last year or the last 5 years or whatever it might be. And you only have 50 pounds. You got 50 pounds, that's it. You don't have 275 pounds, you got 50 pounds. Well, the first thing that I would say is that you may have heard of the concept of the mind-muscle connection. When you're lifting 275 pounds, especially if you're lifting it for like 5 repetitions, but even if you were to lift it for like 12 repetitions, a lot of lifters don't focus on the mind-muscle connection. They just lift the weight, which is perfectly fine. You're just trying to lift the weight as quickly as possible if you're working on power, or you're just trying to lift the weight in general and hit the number of repetitions that you wanted to lift. But when you're trying to maintain musculature or trying to gain musculature, the mind-muscle connection can be an incredibly powerful tool to realizing real growth in a particular area. You might realize that even though you're doing the same exact movement, let's say a squat, say a front squat, or doing a goblet squat or something along those lines, so it's still a squat, right? But it's not a standard barbell squat that you did with your 275 pounds. What you'll find is that you might get sore in certain areas that you didn't think you'd get sore in just using 50 pounds. That didn't cross your mind. Now, of course, soreness isn't exactly a proxy for muscle growth, but it is an indication that you're doing something to that particular region of the body. So using this mind-muscle connection of trying to really feel out the musculature. Let's say you're in the hole of the squat, at the very bottom of the squat. Do you actually feel that musculature tightening up as it's trying to stabilize you, as it's trying to maintain your posture? And then when you shoot back up out of that position, do you really feel the musculature? Are you concentrating on the muscles that you want to build, those really firing those muscles? Because it's a very subconscious thing to just have a lot of weight on your back, and you build these motor patterns that are sort of innate. You don't necessarily have to think about them a whole lot, so you're just going through your motions. And that's not to say that you're not building muscle. Of course you are, because you have to have that musculature there that's going to be activating and therefore leading to growth of that muscle, because you're continuously getting stronger, or you're doing more repetitions, or whatever it might be. Again, adding to the overall volume. Now, in this situation, because the intensity is so low, you can focus on something like mind-muscle connection, wherein you are doing everything possible not to just knock out the repetitions like you normally would, but to really focus in on the different sections of the lift. So, for example, the squat. You get, as you're lowering yourself into the bottom position of the squat, the glutes are really going to be firing at that point, especially as you're starting to come back out of it. So really focusing on driving that hip drive with the glutes, and making sure that you're activating or working to activate your quads as well, will allow you to end up tiring those muscles out a lot faster than you might imagine. And to add to that, to actually create that mind-muscle connection, what I like to do is focus on time under tension, which may be a concept you may be familiar with already, but increasing the time under tension. So throughout, let's say, if you break down a repetition of an exercise, as you're lowering into the squat, let's say typically it would take you 1.5 seconds to do that, and then come back up in another 1.5 seconds. Well, let's say you were to double that. So suddenly it takes you're consciously now taking 3 seconds to lower into the squat, and then 3 seconds back up. That is a devastating technique that will surely lead to some pretty extreme differences in what you're going to feel in your legs and in your butt. So that is certainly a technique that I certainly use, and a lot of other people use, especially when they're using much, much lighter weights. So the intensity is much lower in terms of the weight, but the intensity in terms of how you're going about the exercise is completely different. So suddenly that part gets ramped up. So, and the big point here is that the musculature has no clue. It has no clue that it's lifting 275 pounds. So when you are lifting 275 pounds, you weren't making those conscious efforts. So in terms of creating that mind-muscle connection, creating that time under tension, that extended time under tension, you were actually minimizing those, because you were so focused on trying to blast up the weight and just relying on the weight itself just as a measure, a benchmark to continuously increase, which is perfectly all right. And that's how a lot of people do it. But when you're limited on the weight, then you have to start focusing on the other areas, which would be something like time under tension. Suddenly, when you're really trying to feel the squat, every single repetition, it gets pretty painful, even with something as low as 50 pounds. So in that situation, you might want to do something like a pause squat, where you're not bouncing off the bottom of the squat. You might get into that position, rest there for a second, and then come back up. And that's going to create a lot of stress on your glutes. And, about halfway up, it's really going to focus quite a bit on your quads as well. So those are a few different things that can really focus on increasing that mind-muscle connection. Another thing that I like to do is changing the angles. Specifically, if I want to work on, let's say, the glutes, I'll increase my stance quite substantially, or If you're doing like a push-up, you can certainly increase the stance in terms of your arms, how far away your arms are from your body. If you've got them very narrow in, you can really knock them out pretty easily. But if you end up extending them out really, really wide, although the range of motion may decrease, overall the difficulty of the exercise increases quite substantially. And then, of course, if you add in there, not type in, sorry, I'm a little tired. If you add in there that change in tempo, and making those conscious efforts of 1 Mississippi, 2 Mississippi, 3 Mississippi, okay, pause at the bottom, 1 Mississippi, 2 Mississippi, 3 Mississippi, back up. And it doesn't have to be 3. I'm just kind of throwing out one. It could be as much as like 10 seconds, which would be absolutely excruciating to do multiple repetitions of that. And then another thing that I like to do, kind of the final thing that I like to do, is not just change hand position or foot position, not just change like the angles of the movements, not just increase the time under tension. All of those would feed into this mind-muscle connection, with the idea that if you're not feeling it in the exact part of the muscle that you want, you should adjust how you're going through that motion to really penetrate that exact area. So the final thing is to use isolateral movements. So, for example, today I was limited on equipment. That's actually how I came up with this particular topic, or why I wanted to address it this time. And you can switch exercises, a lot of exercises, maybe not all exercises, not efficiently at least, but a lot of exercises you can switch to be a single hemisphere of your body. So you just focus on one leg, for example. A good example of this, you could still do that with squats, right? You could do something like a pistol squat, but that takes a lot of balance. You have to have a good amount of flexibility, and that can be really tricky. So you could do something like a split squat, which is what I typically go with. So doing something like a split squat where you're just focusing on one leg at a time. So you do like 8 repetitions, 10, 12, whatever, on one leg, and then you switch to the other leg. Another thing is what I found is something like a hip thrust. If I'm doing a hip thrust, normally I'd be able to do quite a decent amount of weight when it comes to a hip thrust. But this time around, again, let's take our example of 50 pounds. While with a hip thrust, you could have maybe done 315 pounds for 12 repetitions with good form. Now you only have 50 pounds. That's substantially less. So what you can do is really, again, increase the time under tension, but also lift one of your legs up so that all of that weight, so suddenly you're shifting all of that resistance, all of that weight from your body weight, therefore increasing intensity onto that one side of your body, and just relying on that one side of your body, and then really focusing on form and making sure that the glute is contracting the way that it's supposed to. And you'll find that even with that additional, just a mere 50 pounds, even though you would think that something like that, you could mathematically figure it out, like you just need to cut the weight in half, right? So like moving from, let's say, like 300 pounds to just 150 pounds for just that one side. Well, it doesn't exactly equate that way. And again, if you start focusing on those other areas of increasing time under tension, suddenly that does play a huge role, to the point where there's no way you could have done 150 pounds. You could maybe do 150 pounds the way that you were doing things, but you can't do it this new way where you're really focusing on experiencing the muscle the way that it's supposed to, making sure that it's firing the way that it's supposed to. Which, don't get me wrong, I don't want you to walk away from this thinking some sort of voodoo thing where, the muscle isn't firing when you're lifting 315 pounds or 300 pounds. It is, no doubt. Otherwise, the weight wouldn't go up. I'm just saying in this situation that you're really focusing on that exact musculature that you want to work. You're not necessarily you're actively trying to take out accessory muscle groups and not rely on those, and really focus in on that one muscle that you're really trying to build. So in this situation with the hip thrust, the glutes. So those are a few things. And again, just as another reminder that the muscle cells don't think, they don't know. So if you reach failure, let's say if you reach near failure or you reach failure after 8 repetitions, you've done it. Like that's it. You've figured out an intensity, a baseline intensity that you can then build off of for weeks, months, years afterward. And it's not based off of the amount of weight that's on you, but based off of the actual difficulty of the exercise, which brings us full circle to what I was talking about earlier, that although the total amount of weight may be drastically diminished, the intensity is just as intense, simply because of all these techniques that we've been talking about. So if at the end of 10 repetitions, you're barely eking out your 10th repetition, that's going to be plenty to maintain your musculature moving forward, as long as you're continuously building off of this this new baseline that you're creating for yourself in your apartment or your home, or wherever this limited equipment setting is. So I wanted to convey that information across. Again, I decided I was going to cover this a few months back, but I just ended up scrapping that, mainly because, well, actually, I have no real clue as to why, but I ended up scrapping it. So there's the information anyway. So it may be a bit delayed, but it's out there now. Okay, the second topic is just quick to talk about a little bit on cancer. And I mentioned that my family's dog, who we haven't had for that long, he's actually quite young, which is really surprising that he ended up developing cancer. But he has stage 5 lymphoma. And yes, there are 5 stages for lymphoma. Usually you'd think 4 stages for cancers. And for him, I mean, it's a done deal. Like he's not going to survive, simply because of the type of cancer that it is, and the fact that it's so progressed, of course, stage 5. But we decided to have him go through chemotherapy, because apparently, I'm not a vet, of course, but apparently chemotherapy is extremely well tolerated for dogs. And actually, over the last few months, he's tolerated it just unbelievably well. He's been really happy and peppy, and obviously his tumors have shrunk to basically nothing. But unfortunately, the reality is that regardless of that, cancer eventually finds a way around this chemotherapy. So chemotherapy essentially just blocks cancer's ability, and really all dividing cells, so it's not specific to cancer, but it blocks cancer's ability to divide. So dividing cells are unable to divide due to chemotherapy drugs. And chemotherapy drugs target different subcellular molecular mechanisms within the cell to stop it from dividing. And when you stop it from dividing, you can also sometimes do damage to the DNA, or you can stop it during its replication process. And because you're stopping it through its replication process, there's a series of different triggers that end up leading the cell to decide, quote unquote, decide to undergo apoptosis or programmed cell death. So cancer goes through this process of having sidestepped a lot of the cellular mechanisms that would force it to undergo apoptosis under regular conditions, and therefore continues to propagate itself, continues to multiply itself kind of aberrantly. Well, it is aberrant, so it's not something that your body wants. But chemotherapy forces the cell to activate other apoptotic mechanisms that are based off of the actual cell splitting. So if cells have some sort of problem when they're going through mitosis or cell splitting, then they've got a bunch of mechanisms therein that will then trigger this apoptotic mechanism, which is a good thing. That's what you want. If something's going wrong with either cell, or during the process, you want to get rid of those cells, because they're going to be non-functional. They're not going to do anything for you. You don't want a big accumulation of non-functional cells. So chemotherapy targets specifically dividing cells, and that's why it can be pretty detrimental to really any dividing cells, to your immune system, to your intestinal tract. I mean, there's certain parts of your body that have fast turnover, as in they're constantly dividing. So as such, chemotherapy is going to have widespread effects across the body, and people feel really miserable while they're on chemotherapy. Now, during a treatment of chemotherapy, the idea is that you're attacking a lot of these cells, these cancer cells that are dividing really quickly. And because they're dividing so quickly, you're going to be doing a lot more damage to those cells than you are to normal physiologically relevant cells. So as such, cancer ends up killing itself, right? All these cells are suddenly having these triggers to kill themselves, and that's what they do. They go through programmed cell death. Now, unfortunately, certain cancer cells, even within a particular type of cancer, not all the cancer cells are going to be dividing at the exact same rate. So you might have some that will be dividing relatively slowly, even near physiological levels. And if that's the case, then the chemotherapy might miss it. So it might kill off many of the cancer cells. It might kill off some of the most aggressive cancer cells, and it might even kill off some of the slower dividing cells, but it still will miss certain cancer cells because they just won't be going through that division process. Now, so then, because you're missing them, then eventually those cancer cells can repopulate themselves and will eventually start to build back up. So that's incredibly unfortunate, especially if you have a type of cancer that well, I guess in either situation, if it can or can't be cured simply by chemotherapy. Now, another thing that cancer does is that cells can actually go dormant. And this is true for physiological cells as well. And what I mean by physiological, I mean cells that are supposed to be functioning in your body the way that they're fulfilling their function as needed within the body. Cancer would be a pathophysiological state. So cancer cells can go dormant where they don't divide, which is kind of a cool and kind of creepy thing, right? That these cells that are supposed to be dividing nonstop can actually become quiet. And it's like you can think of like a spotlight. Chemotherapy is the spotlight in the prison, looking for the escaped prisoner, and the prisoner's just flat up against the wall, and the spotlight doesn't detect it because the person isn't moving, and it's just like a dark area, so the spotlight isn't covering that particular section of the prison. So it's a similar thing here. So you can have certain cancer cells that can be, in a manner of speaking, kind of gluing themselves up against the wall, and then the spotlight, the chemotherapy, ends up missing it, or doesn't have as potent of an action on it. So that's a possibility. That's also another possibility. And then those cancer cells, once the chemotherapy treatment is over, they'll start to repopulate themselves, and they'll start dividing as they would, which is really unfortunate. Another thing is that cancer cells can also pump drugs out, which is a weird phenomenon, but it is possible for a chemotherapy drug to enter the cell and for the cell to say, nah, and just bounce it back out, just kick it back out into the extracellular matrix, or fluid, which would then preserve the cell. So it really depends on the chemotherapy drug. And that's why certain chemotherapies, or at least one of the reasons why certain chemotherapy drugs are incredibly aggressive and work extremely well against certain cancers, and then other chemotherapy drugs don't have that impact. Because they can get kicked out, or they just simply don't act on the particular sections of the cancer's problematic molecular mechanisms that you might want or that you might need. So there's a number of different reasons, and certainly more than what I'm listing here, but there's a number of different reasons as to why cancer can then come back over time, even though it feels like the chemotherapy is working. And maybe, I mean, certainly it is working. It might destroy 95% of the cancer cells, but that's not enough. Eventually you can have micrometastasis where single cells can end up finding their way to other areas of the body, or you can just have these dormant cells, or you can have cancer cells that are immediately resilient to these chemotherapy drugs. Or another situation is cancer cells can continue to mutate, where what the chemotherapy drug was targeting, now that ends up mutating, and then the chemotherapy drug is no longer effective against that cell. Now, granted, then the issue is that if that cell ends up dividing, that mutation carries on to 2 cells, and then that mutation carries on to 4 cells, and it continues to go like that, and it continues to propagate itself to a point where you have now a new colony of these cancer cells that have all of the old characteristics, or most of the old characteristics of the previous cancer, but they also have a resistance to the chemotherapy that you were using prior. So then you have to switch to a different chemotherapy from that point on. Okay, well, hopefully that was informative. Hopefully you got something out of it. Hopefully some applicable information in there, and also some interesting information when it came to cancer. Hopefully you understand why chemotherapy works and why it doesn't. And I'll certainly be covering all these topics in more detail in the future, but that's where I'll leave it for now. And thanks for tuning in, and I wish you a wonderful day. I'll catch you on the flip side. See ya.